Salam, everyone. Another TSN for you guys. For those of you guys who don't know, TSN is the Samovar Network. If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you're new, what TSN is a group of Afghan-Americans that discuss different things that are going on in the community and get a little comfortable in the uncomfortable situations. My name is Dawood. I'm going to be one of your moderators from tonight. I'm from Orange County, and then Noura is co-moderating. Noura, you want to take it away?
Yes, thanks. I'm excited we get to do this live. Dawood and I have moderated in person. My name is Noura. I'm calling in from Durham, North Carolina, and this is our last broadcast of 2017. Get excited, fam. So it kind of makes sense that we end on this note in some ways, because we as a collective started as friends discussing current events and the state of affairs. And as many of you know, this past year with the administration has made politics a point of conversation, even for people who don't really care to talk about politics all the time like we do. But really, the point of tonight, the topic is, can you hear us, or can you hear me now? With everything we're seeing in politics, we wanted to have a conversation of what real representation means. Now that Afghan Americans are running for office in both parties, who do we align ourselves with, and do we owe them our support? What does it mean for Afghans to support Republicans? Is the Democratic Party any better? We want to explore these questions. We have an awesome line of panelists tonight, some returning faces y'all might recognize and some new voices. I want to go ahead and introduce the new voices. Sarah, if you could introduce yourself and maybe tell us what's on your mind. This weekend has been kind of crazy with the tax legislation up in the House and Senate. Give us some of your thoughts as you introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. So, hey everyone, this is actually my first Samovar Network call watching or participating in. So I'm just doing all of those things at one time. And I mean, to just echo what you just said, it's really wild for me to be here at all, on the screen, because at the beginning of 2017, I didn't know any of y'all. And so I went to AAC and then SLI, and, here I am. So in terms of even feeling able to talk about the Afghan community, I've come a hugely long way this year, I feel like. So this was in my little intro on the Facebook page, but I am in law school at the University of Georgia. So a lot of what's on my mind is that we just won the SEC championship for the first time in 12 years, and then I'm about to go into finals. But other than that, certainly the tax bill, certainly the impact that it's going to have on a lot of my grad student friends who are not getting these immediate professional degrees, and on a lot of my law school friends, because if you want to go into public interest law, you sort of are resigning yourself to never making any money, and a lot of folks have relied on these public interest loan forgiveness programs that have now been completely wiped out. So I want to go ahead and pass it off before we all start talking a ton about that, but that's where I'm at on that.
Awesome. And why, if you introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Humaira. I'm from Fremont, California, calling in, probably the most Afghan place in the United States there is. I'm very excited about this call, about this topic. What's on my mind, I just got back from DC, which is very relevant to what we're talking about. I was there when the whole Flynn testimony thing just exploded, essentially. So that was very exciting. And I am personally really excited to be with this panel. And I don't know if we're getting into our background or not, but I'm excited to be on the call.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely get into your background. I have some questions for you. And some returning faces. Ali, Reza? Ali, who are you?
Hi, I'm Ali. I'm from Orange County. I'm a doctoral candidate in history, which sounds horribly boring, but I promise you it's actually quite exciting. I'm going to try to use a little bit of those history chops to discuss some stuff today. I'm very excited about this call, and the things that are going through my mind are really the Flynn testimony, which I thought was quite huge. My colleagues are kind of fascinated watching history unfold itself, regardless of where your politics are. The reality is like we're living through a Watergate moment, but as my colleagues say, it's like a Watergate for dumb people. So it's super interesting, and I'm wondering like what historians are going to say in the future, and definitely worried about the tax bill as a person who is in graduate school and have colleagues who are living, you know, a bare substance life. It's something that's quite worrying to see, and wondering what my colleagues are going to deal with it. I'm going to deal with it. So lots of thoughts.
So hi, my name is Reza, and I'm a med student. I go to school in New Hampshire. In terms of things that are on my mind, I think the biggest thing on my mind is how people discuss the things that go on in politics right now, especially with the Flynn testimony. There's a lot of inside baseball talk that happens when people try to discuss politics, and I think that kind of pollutes and muddles our discussions, and it can turn genuinely interesting things like the Flynn testimony into more gossip, which dilutes the actual impact that things like this will have on the rest of our society. So how we talk about politics is really what's on my mind right now, and probably why I'm here today.
And Reza, I'll get into it, but you've worked for campaigns in the past? Word on the street is?
Yeah, okay, so I guess divulging my conflict of interest here. In 2012...
You don't have to. I just think it's cool.
It's all right. In 2012, I was an intern for President Obama's campaign and a field organizer as well in Chicago and in Colorado. So that's my conflict of interest. I'm a registered independent, but whatever. Anyways, thank you.
Oh, we're gonna get into that. Okay. Lots of questions there. I think this might be the East Coast influence in you. But let's get into the first question. Are Afghans a monolith? And I wanted to turn this question specifically to Humaira John, because you are on the organizing committee for the Afghan-American conference, which is probably the largest umbrella group of Afghans, diaspora Afghans within our age group in the United States. And you have seen, you've seen a lot of folks come in and a year out, and maybe you can kind of lend us an ear into, are we really a monolith? Like, what trends do you see?
Can y'all hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
we can.
great. For a moment there, I think it froze for everyone. So to answer the question, are we a monolith as an Afghan-American community? In my brief but in-depth experience with the community, I would say no. I do not think we're a monolith. I think we have a wide spectrum in regards to almost every topic, such as religion, cultural connection to the homeland, socioeconomic background, citizenship status, which I think also is a big part of how people impact their day-to-day lives. For example, we even have, I think as someone mentioned before, 2 candidates who are running on 2 different parties. We have a Democrat and Republican. And so I think that alone is an example of how different we really are as a community in such a short time span that we've been here in the United States. You know, I always think about the fact that you can have 2 Afghans in a room and 4 different opinions. Like, that's how I kind of visualize Afghans with a lot of issues. So I would definitely say we are not a monolith, which is, I think, a blessing and a curse.
So
now, oh, sorry. I was going to say, it's not being a monolith. Do you think, though, in general and in this panel, towards the same goal? Like, just as Afghans, even though we have different opinions, there is something that we're trying to reach towards?
You know, I don't think everyone's goal of what they're reaching is necessarily the same. And I think one of the small examples I've noticed for this, but that I found is persistent is, for instance, Afghan translators. That's a very hot button topic whenever I'm around family, because you have one person saying you're helping the homeland and someone else saying you're destroying the homeland. even as simple as volunteering to be a translator or working with US troops. And it's kind of like the goal is everyone wants to help homeland, right? Even that small little whether or not you volunteer, everyone takes it in a different way. So even when you have the same goal, the methodology really, really matters and how you go about it. But some people really want to have bad memories and don't want to have anything to do and don't want to go back there and only see kind of ethnic cleansing to a certain extent of their community from where they're from. So not everyone, I would think, agrees with that either.
Yeah, I think a lot about there are some shared experiences, but then even the way that the war was experienced or the process of coming here has been so different for people that it's often outsider influences trying to lump us all together as one. And we've seen this done with Asian Americans, with Latinos, where we look the same, we come from the same country, so people try to box us in a certain way. And on one hand, we can use that to our advantage. On the other hand, it really does simplify what is a very, very dynamic community. Reza, did you have some thoughts on that?
On what? On how diverse we are, or
Yeah, like,
how
are we
we're not
really
all
a
reaching towards
monolith?
the same goal?
Should we
I
be a
mean,
monolith?
No, we're not a monolith. I think that's and it's, to be honest with you, it's an easy question to answer. It's not really an answer that a lot of people outside of the Afghan community feel comfortable with, but it's something that I think that a lot of people in the Afghan community know and understand, even if they make jokes about it, right? Like Humaira said, you can put two Afghans in a room, there's 4 opinions. That's a joke that's been told to me since I was a kid. And so, like,
It's the first I've heard of it.
right. Okay. So, but like, you felt it, right? You felt it
Yeah,
in
totally.
holiday parties or whatever, right? So like, it's an easy question to answer that no, we're not a monolith. I think the harder question to answer is, can we polarize ourselves or enough of ourselves to act monolithically for a same goal? And then afterwards,
Did Reza freeze or was it just me? Gosh, like at the most important part of the point. So when he comes back,
It was important. It was from Reza.
so we'll have him finish the polarizing to unpolarizing point because it actually relates to the next question we had, which was for Sarah. I mean, if we aren't a monolith, like how does where does representation come in? And before we get into that, can you help it? Representation and the term advocacy are kind of brought in at the same time in conversation. Can you kind of guide us through what the difference is between representation and advocacy? And then we can maybe get into a little more about representation, and hopefully Reza will be back by then too.
Sure. So from, I guess, like a community organizing perspective, which is the main experience that I'm bringing in here, to me, representation is sort of about self-representation, and actually being able to speak like from your personal experiences and from what you think the goals and ideals of your community are. And advocacy to me is someone else doing that. So primarily, I've actually worked with undocumented communities, largely Latinx, some not, and neither of those are demographics that I belong to. There is a problem, especially with folks who are, trying to work as allies for maybe the first time or haven't thought about it a ton, as saying they represent someone who they aren't. And so I think when you advocate, you have to be really careful about sort of not putting words in anyone's mouth and about choosing a cause to advocate for, that if you are outside the demographic it impacts, choosing one that resonates with your ideologies and with the demographics that you belong to. Because even though the folks I was working with were not Afghan, like my Afghanness majorly informed the way that I went about it. And so I think there's kind of a lot to go on there with how I feel about electoral politics and representation there. There's a really interesting question sort of queued up for us, I think, about Israeli-Palestinian relations that I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts on. But if anyone else wants to chime in on that.
chime in on that, but representation and like, who do we want, right? That's a huge question. We do have a man running for Congress right now. Ali, I don't know when to jump in on this, but there like an answer to that from your point of view?
You cut in. Could you repeat the question?
I said, who do we want to represent us, right? Because that's a big thing right now. Like, we have two people running for office. Think about that.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of the crux of what we're getting at when it comes to representation, when it comes to advocacy. It's not an easy answer because you're stuck within a certain model, right? And that is Republican and Democrat. And we often hear that both sides are the same, and to a certain extent, both sides have deep problems. But the idea that both sides are the same is just factually not correct. And so the question comes like, well, okay, where do we fit as Afghans within the party system, right? Even if we don't like the party system, and maybe we hope to change the party system, and maybe we want third party, etc. But at the end of the day, we have to ask, where do we fit amongst Democrats and Republicans? And the reality is that you have one party that has quite openly espoused some form of white supremacy and has done so for a long period of time. And we have to come to that realization. And we have to recognize that that becomes an important part of how the current administration came about. I think one CNN contributor, quite brilliantly, Van Jones, put it as a white lash. And people kind of joked it off and like, oh no, it's not really a white lash, it's economic anxiety. But I'm sorry, that's kind of bullshit. It is a white lash. If you understand the history of American politics, after the Civil War, there was roughly, after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction, there was roughly 2,000 black politicians. This is something that we often gloss over in American history. We act as if Civil War happened and then black politicians didn't emerge or black communities didn't step into the spotlight in America. One of the first black congressmen, Hiram Revels, was in 1870. But what people forget is that right after the emergence and success of these black communities and local black politicians was the Reconstruction, which was a white lash, intended to erase the black character of the South and produce a new white hegemony, a reign of terror that involved lynchings, so extrajudicial acts as well as judicial acts, things like Jim Crow. This is the legacy that we have to contend with. And then it emerges and merges with the Republican Party under Nixon. I mean, you can't look at Nixon without recognizing that he ran on law and order post-civil rights. The coded language of the Southern strategy of, hey, white people, we're going to reclaim your cities for you. That was Nixon for you. Look at the NRA in the 1940s, which fundamentally was an organization about gun safety. And then look at the NRA post-civil rights. Protect yourselves. You need self-defense. The cities are dangerous. That's coded language. All of that produces Donald Trump. That is the Republican Party today. That is the reality we have to confront. Now, the Democrats are better than that, but the Democrats have their own flaws. What the Democrats have done is they've absorbed a certain superficial level of identity politics. Okay, you're LGBTQ, we're going to put you in Congress. Okay, you're a woman, we're going to put you in Congress, without recognizing really true, deep intersectionality. And intersectionality is, I think, where we as a community come in. So that, yeah, we can recognize that these parties aren't, that the Democratic Party may not be perfect, but there is more opportunity there versus the white supremacy that we see.
Can you define what intersectionality is?
So I'll give you actually an example of intersectionality. Intersectionality is the ability of communities to build coalitions based off of systems of oppression, recognizing that system of oppression affects people in different ways. I think, in my humble opinion, one of the greatest examples of a kind of intersectional policy that we can address is criminal justice reform. Criminal justice reform disproportionately affects the black community. Black Americans and black males in particular are affected by it. But because they're affected by it, so too are undocumented people, so too are LGBTQ, so too are women. Criminal justice reform then becomes an intersectional issue, a point by which all these communities can rally around. So if we can focus on policies and true change, I think that's where the Afghan community can step in and move beyond the failures of the two-party system.
Yeah. And I think this is where I get pessimistic. As someone studying political science, it was only when I entered the PhD program that I realized that John Burgess, who's the founder of the discipline of political science, his book was on why it was around the Reconstruction and essentially saying Blacks shouldn't have power. And he built at Columbia University this entire research agenda around how Blacks are inferior to whites. I'm simplifying the argument, but that horrified me. And so part of me does feel pessimistic, and I want to turn to Humaira for this question. There seems to be some hope, but some trepidation. Is it important to have Afghans run for office given the current state of affairs and this whitelash? Like, is it even worth it?
Personally, I think it's incredibly important for Afghans to run for office because of the whitelash almost and the history we have in this country. I think 9/11 was incredibly pivotal for our community, and I think that really set kind of a tone for how our community was going to be treated in the U.S. And so I think because of, so I would say what Ali John was talking about, the criminal justice reform is for African-American community here. I would say the Department of Defense and any kind of war decisions is to our community. Like there's over $2 trillion that's gone into war in Afghanistan at this point. That's directly affecting a lot of our families back home and a lot of people who have just gone here and their ability to go out and do any kind of study abroad possibly, and to be able to escape kind of that war that's happening. Something that I think we talked about a little bit was how important is it to be involved in the census, and why, and how is it ways, and why does it matter? I remember when I was a little girl, my mom would work for the county and she would try so hard to get Afghans to register for the census, and they wouldn't, because they're afraid of getting documented. They're afraid of like, what is this paper? What am I signing? Language barrier was definitely something that was an obstacle. And I remember her being incredibly frustrated because she was saying like, when we don't have our numbers, we don't count. And no one's going to care about trying to cater to the Afghan-American community if they don't think there is one. We're going to just leave aside the whole issue of how we're not properly documented because we're either other or Caucasian. We're going to just ignore that for this talk for now. But, if you're not, you can't win if you're not running. There's no way we can get involved and do something and advocate for our community if we're not involved in the politics, in the decision making, in the people who are distributing money in different areas. So I am a big proponent of Afghans running, particularly because of everything that's going on.
So I'm gonna jump in here. I might have to take my facilitator hat off for a little bit on this one. But I want to address the elephant in the room here, because we do have an Afghan Republican running for Congress, right, in a county in San Diego. And is that the kind of person that we want to represent us? Personally, like, I made a fuss about it because I want to represent me in office. Like I talk to the guy, I see where his views are, and it's not something that I align with, right? But how important that we have someone like in office? Is it just the face that we need, right? Like I was told from other friends was like, dude, you got to support this guy. He's Afghan. That's all that matters, right? But when is being Afghan not enough? Anyone wants to jump in on that question? Ali, if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think I echo what Humaira John said. Like, it's so important to be at that table, and it's so important to be involved. But the question is, like, when is being Afghan not enough? It's when a brown face starts to espouse white supremacy, right? When it makes white supremacy more palatable, when it makes it more, hey, you too can participate in white supremacy if you just work hard. That's not the type of representation that we need. And then this isn't about any one particular person, but a political platform that we have to address. If you are going to run as a Republican in today's world, great. Answer some questions for me. Where were you when Donald Trump didn't say anything about an American being killed by white supremacists? Where were you when he called for a total and complete shutdown on Muslims? Where were you when people were shouting the N-word at his rallies? This is the political platform that exists within America today. And that doesn't mean all Republicans all racists or all Republicans hate brown people, but it means that anyone who votes Republican has to square away their vote with these realities and with the history that Republicans bring in. So I personally don't believe that that's the type of representation that we need. But if a Republican can answer me those questions, and if it can square those away, then I'm all ears.
Yeah, not just representation though, but is there even like room in today's climate, right? Like you mentioned a lot about where people were when Donald Trump said this, and where people were when Trump supporters said, you know, like what they did. And like, given that context, like, is there room for Afghan Republicans? Like, do we even want to hear them out at this point? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. Reza, you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of like, is there room for Afghan Republicans? I don't think that's a question of like control, right? Is there room for people where we sit? And that's not something that we can control, right? I'll say his name, the Omar Qudrat, who's running in San Diego, right? As a Republican on a ticket.
You're spilling that tea.
I don't know. It's like Voldemort. Like, why not say the name? Sorry, Qudrat, if I called you Voldemort. I mean, anyways, it's like the thing is like we
said we were going to get honest.
You can't control him running or not, right? He's going to run. He's going to say that he's Afghan, and he's going to use that as a part of his platform. And you can't stop that from happening, right? You can stop yourself from voting. You can stop yourself from donating, right? So I think the question of like whether or not there's room for an Afghan Republican, I think it presents a false premise that we control who gets into that room, and we don't, right? What we do control, right, is how we respond to that, and how we respond to Afghan Democrats as well, right? There's a recent picture of Kamala Harris, and she was shaking hands with Benjamin Netanyahu, right? And Muslim Facebook exploded. You know, like just everybody got pissed that she was shaking hands and smiling with this purveyor of murder and genocide, et cetera, and apartheid, et cetera, right? And suddenly her purity as a Democrat, her purity as someone that people of color can get behind was destroyed, right? And so I think maybe to tweak the question and then put it back to everybody, right? Do we have room for candidates who will make compromises, right? Because at the end of the day, when you are a senator, there's only 100 of you, right? You all know each other. I go to school right now with 92 people. We all know each other's business. It's super annoying, right? Mm-hmm. And if you get into an argument with someone, it spreads like wildfire. Can you imagine how getting into a personal argument behind closed doors would be like for a senator, right? And so I'm not saying we have to sympathize with them, but I am asking, can we get behind people who compromise?
Well, so I have some thoughts on, sort of infighting in groups of 100 people, and my law school experience is why I'm never going to try to be a senator, because that would just not pan out very well for anyone. But going back to sort of having room for a Republican and what that entails for the Afghan community, I think what hasn't really been addressed yet is the possibility of identity-based voting, right, for folks who have not been paying attention to the issues, or who do feel that their sense of Afghanness is going to outweigh, their actual interests. Because I'm saying this being very physically and politically removed from San Diego, but in the Atlanta mayoral race, we're about to have a runoff between one old white woman who everyone knows is there because all of the white rich people in a certain part of Atlanta gave her that plurality. And then sort of there's a whole slew of other candidates. The person who ended up being in the runoff is this woman who is young and Black and a lawyer, but whose track record is bad. And sort of the conventional wisdom that's across Atlanta is, well, one, she's not Mary Norwood, so we're going to vote for her. And that's sort of just a lesser evilism. Which also, we can go back to the Democratic Party there. But I think letting her into that position, because there were so many not educated or not having time to do their research on literally a dozen mayoral candidates. Just working class folks, either Black people, brown people, documented people who are allowed to vote in the mayoral election, right, which is already excluding a lot of Atlanta, who kind of just said, well, she's high achieving and she's a woman and she's Black, so probably this is the most progressive person we can vote for. She's not the establishment and she looks like me, so we should vote for her. And, I think that espouses this sort of really dangerous view that the best thing, anyone can achieve for their community is to rise to that kind of, electoral leadership, absent any contact with the people they're going to be representing, because she didn't make any. But then also, sort of by letting one of us get that far, I think you do expose the risk that based on identity voting, they and their really bad ideas are going to get voted into office, even if we don't espouse that identity politics.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? Because at least in terms of research on how people feel, when you are a constituent who's a minority and you see someone like you in office, it increases, there's this term political efficacy, it increases this sense of of optimism within you internally. And so that plays a role, and we can't diminish that in the sense that there is research to suggest that does something, but does that really substantively assist communities or not? And you're identifying the problematic part where it's not completely it's a challenge, right? Diz, you had a question though from
Yeah, we got a question in from Suf on Facebook, and she asks, which one comes first? Having someone represent us in politics, or having Afghan-American concerns, or tackling issues for the motherland and the people? Or can they be tackled at once? So does anyone want to jump in on that one? Sorry, Nura,
Kabul versus Fremont, who's more important? And Homaira, you got to this a little bit when you were talking about why Afghans should run for office. So then, do we worry about the war in Afghanistan and what's going on there? But then there's the dynamic of the census here. Where should we put our attention?
Yeah, I think this is it's a complicated question because it's assuming that we know best for Afghanistan. Frankly, we haven't lived there in a long time, so do we really know best? But putting that aside, and it's just that we have the passion, we care, we want to do something. I think the only way we can influence international politics is, again, kind of being at the door and being in those cabinet meetings to be able to even have a say, right? So as much as we want to, I do think being in the door and being those meetings does matter. Protests are great, and those other forms of activism, but I'm a believer of you have to be a part of the system to be able to break it down and do something about it a bit. And I think you need both people. So I think first comes getting in there to be able to help Afghanistan and being able to do something about it, which does kind of go into the conversation Sarah was saying, is when we have these tokenized candidates going up for office, what do they represent? Do they represent what they really want to do, or do they represent the money they're getting to run with a campaign they're going with, right? Who are they getting support for? I mean, this is coming down to the fact that our community doesn't have enough support to maybe put up candidates. They're having to go to other people to get money to be able to run, to do things. And then they're going to have to, fend for their beliefs as well and help see what they want to get because they're the ones giving them money. So it's a very multi-layered kind of issue. And I think I basically didn't answer your question at all, other than give you more questions to think about.
No, that's helpful. I kind of want to be nosy and ask you about, and then we'll return to this question and get others to weigh in, but you were student body president at UCLA. So one of the largest and most prestigious public institutions in the United States and arguably the world. What was that like? I think that women don't, I want to just amplify how awesome that is. But what was that like? And you saw some of this negotiation happen. Did you feel tokenized being the first Afghan student body president? What was that like?
It's kind of, I didn't feel too tokenized because our our whole slate was basically a tokenized slate. I ran with, very progressive slate filled with minority students, frankly, and that's the slate I chose to run with. So I was one of the many tokens, so it made me less tokenized, I suppose, if you'll say. But it was very interesting because there are certain things I just wouldn't do that the other candidates would do. I refused to go to the frat parties and try to get votes. I didn't drink, so that was definitely an inhibitor when they were saying go mingle with people and get them to vote with you. I was a bit more conservative then, where I wouldn't even hug the opposite sex. So when they would have big group powwows, they would have like a separate powwow for me with my own self and then everyone else around me. So I had... But the great thing about it was, despite all of those, what some people would call obstacles, I did win. And it was great to kind of see someone out there from like the MSA, the Muslim Student Association, putting themselves out there with everything they were and kind of getting the vote of the people and not having to bend and fold necessarily. But I think it went down to the issues, and my issues aligned with what I wanted, but I also made sure to bring in a broad spectrum of issues I ran on that not everyone else is necessarily, that's not just very focused on my community alone, but my philosophy and my principles generally that could apply to everyone. But it was a very interesting experience, and I do think the negotiations behind the doors with a lot of students from Bruins for Israel, for example, there was a lot of infighting about resolutions we're passing, about small things like how we're going to allocate office space and what matters more, the group you stand for and the work you do, or how long you've been there. So a lot of a microcosm of the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think that's why I asked, because I think you have a lens into what it was like to be at the table, right? And that kind of makes us return to this question of, okay, so when we're at the table as an Afghan, so outside of like the student space in, let's say, in electoral politics space, do you represent being American in like the interest of that diaspora or foreign affairs? And I know Reza had some points he wanted to bring in, so I'm going to turn to him. But kind of connecting that, because you highlight one point, and yeah, Reza, jump in.
It was actually to sort of push back against the idea that we have to be at that table. I think that the being at the table is fine, right? And the thing is, like, let's say you are at the table and somehow, some way, you manage to be as progressive as you can. You manage to consistently rep your community, and your community is 100% behind you, right? But then you have to think about your staff members, right? Were you able to carry your loyal staff members from your days that you were just running as a state rep, right, and into the House of Representatives, right? And how does that change? How do they change, right, when presented with that much power in their hands? How do the staffs of other people change the way that you act, right? And like the thing is, like, I think that there are ways outside of politics where Afghans can take charge and be effective change agents in their communities and provide something of value. That's what doctors who help in free clinics do. That's what lawyers who do work pro bono do. There is a lot of stuff that we can do outside of politics. It's not the only thing. It isn't. You don't have to run for the House of Representatives off of a threadbare resume, in sort of competitive districts in order to represent Afghans. And that is not a diss just aimed at Omar Qudrat.
So I just wanted to pick up on one thing that Reza just said about sort of coming from these other career backgrounds. And I'm just going to keep telling you guys parables all night about places that aren't the places we're talking about and where there are no Afghans. But one of really the best models I've ever seen of engaging in the community, but then also getting that seat at the table and getting your foot in the door and sort of participating in the institution, right, is actually when I was working in Austin, Texas, a couple years ago. My friend Greg, who, as an aside, just so that everyone can picture him, he's like about my height, and I'm like 5'3", he was maybe like 5'4", and just wore these very loud boots everywhere he went. You could always hear when like Greg was walking up behind you. And he was our policy guy at the time. and was sort of just like my weird uncle at this like labor organizing group, and we did wage theft direct representation. We did some immigration stuff. We were, you know, we went and shouted at Ted Cruz. So it was, you know, that kind of org. Like we actually got the names of people who worked there were banned from going because they knew they would shout at Ted Cruz. But because of the work that he had done, you know, with Workers' Defense in Austin, he actually was, the year after I left, elected to their city council, and it still holds that seat and is doing the exact same thing. He's city councilman Greg now, and that's really like the only story I have that really gives me faith in the electoral representation model. And so I think it does take something other than, I don't want to say the blind ambition, but essentially the stated goal of being there and representing so much as accruing that experience and those connections first, and then sort of out of a caucus of all of these people whose interests you're going to represent, they say, okay, well, like Greg's the most charismatic and his boots are loud, so he's going to go run for city council, but it's basically like we all are. And it has panned out really well, and he has been able to get a lot of really cool stuff through.
So we're kind of talking about getting like a seat at the table. Reza has mentioned that. So we had two people running for Congress, and I had a chance to kind of speak with both of them. And we asked both of them, like, if elected, what kind of people in Congress do you want to work with, and what like committees do you want to work with? And both the answers that they gave were whoever we'll work with. And I don't know if that's the greatest answer. If elected, how do we get our voices across, right? Because that's something that we need to separate ourselves if we're elected. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that one.
I'm going to say something about that. I think one of the things, and this isn't if you're running, but if someone is running, whoever they're running, you are entitled to answers. You are the constituent, right? And you should push and push and push until you get answers. In the case of Omar Qudrat, I pushed until I got the answer, because the answer of I'll work with anyone who wants to work with me, and this is the same regardless of the spectrum. Whoever says this is a bullshit answer, right? It's a very pandering, I'm going to be bipartisan. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what committees do you want to be a part of? Who are you willing to build coalitions with? Because that tells me what type of policies that you're going to try to enact, what type of actions you're going to take. So, for example, when pushed, we heard Omar Qudrat said that he wanted to work with Ed Royce and Dana Roebucker. Ed Royce was the main speaker at an anti-Islamic rally in Riverside. That tells me something. Dana Roebucker is the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. This is a man who celebrated the Tehran bombing. So when Tehran was attacked by Al-Qaeda just recently, Dana Roebucker said, this is great, these are Muslims killing each other. This is problematic for me. This is how you understand where people's policies are. This is where you can push back against, well, I'm going to work on education. Well, what the hell does that mean? Who are you going to work on? And how are you going to work on? Which committees are you going to work through? And the only way to get that answer is to push. You have the right to those answers. And when they don't answer you, call them out on that. If they're a Democrat, if they're a Republican, if Democrats are interested in working with supporting certain foreign affairs committees that end up marginalizing and destroying communities abroad, we should call them out on it. But we can only know them if we fight against that. So, for example, in the case of Nadia Hashemi, I like her platform, but I don't know who she's willing to work with yet. And I want to know who she's willing to work with. What are the committees that she wants to be a part of? Who are the congressmen that she is going to create alliances on? That's going to tell me way more than what she puts on her website. So, and hopefully representatives will hear this not as a critique, but also as a suggestion. Be honest with us. Tell us who you want to work with.
Well, and I think that's where I see the role of, like, we lump people into protesters or like Black Lives Matter. We need these extra organizations that aren't necessarily running for office to hold representatives accountable. Everyone has a part in this symphony, right? And I'm gonna unapologetically shout out, Sarah mentioned SLI. It's the Summer Leadership Initiative, which is part of the Afghan Diaspora for Equality and Progress. And ADEP which, you know, full disclosure, I'm a part of and some other folks are a part of, is unapologetically kind of like organizing on the ground, grassroots, with an agenda that is consistent with people of color that are on the left. That's sort of generally where the issues they align with fall. But I think that the role is that when people like Nadia Hashimi run for office, we're like, these are our priorities. We're interested in Standing Rock. We're interested in immigration. And we need these pressure groups to push representatives and have this. We can't just rely like, okay, we trust Nadia, that's it, right? We need other parts of the community to push back. And ADAP is just one concrete example that comes to mind because I'm a part of it, but we can think of others. But to me, that makes me vote, and I'm going to make y'all vote now. Is it Kabul or Fremont? I vote Fremont. Like, I think for me personally, I grew up here. This is what I know. And I can't help Afghanistan if I don't help people here. So my vote is Fremont. I'm going to make some of y'all vote. Kabul or Fremont or both.
So at the Afghan-American
Don't let me intimidate you.
No. Something that's said that has always stuck to me, right, is we have to help ourselves first here before we can help ourselves back in Afghanistan, right? So we got to matter here before we can matter there. And the mindset that I've always had is I've never been in Afghanistan before. Like, I don't know how well I would fit in. I don't know what I could do to even help. Something here, I might be able to help there. So that's where my mindset is.
So I want to push back just a little bit, because the idea that domestic and foreign policy are completely separate from one another is something that just doesn't pan out in the way that the legal the bills work. So like the way that even the way you allocate money, you toss in provisions that are like, this is an education bill and we're going to fund drones, right? So this is
you're making my job tough. I want black and white answer.
And you know what's funny is, like, I'm actually going to cite a political scientist and Eric Katznelson, who wrote a book.
He's one of my favorites.
Yes, he's great, and he's a fantastic political scientist. But he's a great one because he's a historian.
Okay, I see you.
He wrote this great book called Fear Itself, and what he argues is that post-World War, the order that emerged in America in particular is that the domestic becomes so deeply entwined in foreign policy. Now, where I think the nuance here is and why it's important is, I can't control policy in Afghanistan. I can't, right? I'm not aware of what's going on the ground, and I consider myself an informed person. I've been to Afghanistan. But what I can do is push back on American policy towards Afghanistan. So I can help Fremont by making sure that America is not involved in a military-industrial complex that gets us bound in perpetual war. I can push back on neoliberal imperialism. I can push back on drone policies, because those are American policies. And that helps communities abroad. That helps Yemen, that helps Syria, that helps Afghanistan, while also recognizing that they fundamentally start in the domestic. So these things are entwined for me.
You've saved everyone else, Ali. Humaira, did you want to jump in?
I agree a lot with Ali John and all his comments. And the only thing I'll kind of add is, so I'm Team Fremont, is kind of the whole, I think Reza was saying that, like, you know, being elected isn't the only thing, that the only way you can actually do something. And I agree with that to an extent, but I feel like we as a community have the most to gain from getting a seat, not only in regards to resources and access and being able to influence things internationally, but simply media representation of Afghans. Like, that small thing can be so huge for our community. So I think we have the most to gain out of a lot of communities, and that's why I think representation is important. And what Ali John said in regards to Fremont.
I just want to hop in real quick with sort of a flip side to that. And I agree with everything that both of you two just said, but not to beat a dead horse here, but I think that the need to consider both Fremont and Kabul, so to speak, is what necessitates solidarity work, especially in places like, I'm just going to yell Atlanta really loudly again, where there's not Afghans, right? But there are Palestinian folks running for office. There are Salvadoran folks holding off, you know, and just really recognizing that essentially the same imperialist forces and Pentagon funding that displaced all of us and is the reason that we're here in the first place, having to divide, our attention and our concerns between two places that both matter to us, also displaced all of them. And that there's really a whole generation of us working along the same narrative. And I think there's just a lot of energy to be captured there, both on and off the ballot that hasn't been yet. And it is tangly because we do all have our own very specific places outside the US that we care about and we want to, think about in terms of influencing US policy. But US policy, like I just said, did this to us in the first place. Is it going to matter having an Afghan, having a Salvadoran person at the table saying, hey, don't do that to us again, a third time, a fourth time? So much as, like Ali said, divesting from the larger power structures and economic structures that enable that to keep happening, which is something that I think is done a lot more easily in a coalition by all of the people affected by it, and occasionally maybe the other people who also pick up on that trend.
I just want to say one thing about political representation and getting a seat at the table. If you are intent on getting a seat at the table, don't try to reach too far beyond your means, right? Get a seat on the school board first, right? Get a seat in city council, right? Like, work locally first as much as you can. Build up a better resume than just being a professional or just putting brown people in Guantanamo, right? Like, be local, right? That's better politics. All politics is local for a reason, right? I see it happening every day here in New Hampshire, right? The people here in New Hampshire.
Is this what New Hampshire did to you?
Yeah, I guess. The people here in New Hampshire are affected more by what their local school board decides and by what the New Hampshire state legislature decides than by what a lot of what happens in Congress, okay? So if you are intent on getting a seat at the table, which, mashallah, good for you. That's like Kamara said, it's a good thing to do, right? And it's important in many ways. Try and do it locally, all right? Please.
For once, I agree with Reza. I totally agree. There has not been a single Afghan-American city council member in Fremont, California, which has one of the largest populations of Afghans in the United States. So because Afghans don't register to vote, Afghans don't vote at all, and there's no incentive. They don't understand the needs of being there. So that is my new goal. I'm recruiting all of you.
Is this an early bid? Is this an early announcement?
No, just getting Afghans registered to vote and just serving as translators, frankly, like basic needs, like translating the forms so they know what they're signing up for and making it not scary to like register yourself to vote.
I think that's a shot at Omar Aziz. He's the mayor of Fremont, so become the mayor of Fremont, Omar. Just saying.
Yeah, them fighting words it is.
So I think we're nearing the end. Any thoughts on this huge topic that we'll probably return to in future episodes? But like right now, closing out 2017, this is our last broadcast. Any final thoughts y'all want to end with?
I'll end with one final thought. I have two things to say, real briefly. One is the outline for which you can enact change, and this is based off of what historians have seen throughout time with successful social movements. They look at social movements like the civil rights movement, even religious movements like the movement of Muhammad and the Prophet, right? That is considered a successful social movement. And they've isolated 5 kind of steps that all successful social movements have. And first and foremost, they disrupt. Whatever is going on in society, they disrupt. They bring attention, they push back, they cause things to break apart. Because when you break things apart, you can then rebuild. They build coalitions. That means they think broadly. They don't think of their small community. They think of the way in which all communities are interacted. One of the least understood aspects of early Islam is that it wasn't just Muslims. If you read Fred Donner's book, it was what's known as a community of believers. It involved Jews, Christians, Muslims, all working together to overthrow the imperial order of the Sasanians and the Byzantines. If you understand the civil rights movements, it was the same thing. You had Black Americans fighting for the civil rights movement alongside Jewish Americans, women of color, LGBTQ. all of that. So coalitions. And then once they have a coalition, they build a vision. That is, they have a specific vision they work towards. If you don't have something to work towards, you're never going to enact change. You have to say, this is what the future looks like. I mean, one of the things that depresses me the most about the 21st century is the kind of utopian visions of the 20th century. My inner Marxist is coming out. Those old utopian visions, they're gone, right? Like, we don't have those same, like, this is what the world should look like type messages. And you need that. That's going to motivate people. Once you have the vision, build the action. You can't just share. You just can't like. You can't just retweet. You have to be out on the streets to do it. And then finally, you have to build enduring social structures. It's not just about getting that one vote. It's about making real lasting change, structures. And then the final thing I'm going to say is, look, the system is geared against you. It's meant to keep you uninformed, to disenfranchise you from the vote, to keep you from participating. So please be aware of that and inform yourselves. I'm going to recommend 2 books. One is The Black Reconstruction in America by W.D. Du Bois. It's an underrated book. It's an old book and super.
It's his best book.
It's his best book. And then The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. If you read those 2 books, you've got yourself a solid platform for understanding American politics and what to do about it.
But you may also need therapy after that, because once you realize how screwed up America is, then it needs like hot chocolate and talking to your mom on the phone or something. Thank you. Any other lasting thoughts?
It's fine, Mike. Am I cutting someone off right now?
No, you're good. Go for it.
I try really hard to not sort of always conclude things on like a cheesy, upbeat note, which is a bad, high school newspaper habit, I think. And I could go on with book recommendations for having, actually I'm going to. John Holloway, Change the World Without Taking Power, saying it's okay to say, no, that this is messed up, I'm not going to participate in this anymore, without having a utopian vision to aim at per se. And that
we're going to post all of these on Facebook, by the way, for people listening in.
So I think, that's the book that I'm working my way through right now, and it just has resonated with my life a lot. But on top, the thing is that I think is the most important takeaway for me from this kind of conversation is that in the moment, like right now, we can and we should be doing both. And I think that in a community, it's very possible. And the first thing you have to do is get everyone in a room or in a Google Hangout, as the case may be, and say like, okay, well, we all share, X, Y, and Z ideals. Maybe we don't even have the same like utopian goal that we subscribe to, but that someone is going to get a seat at the table and fix these immediate things. And just, like, get us a community center built, right? And someone's going to go out and canvass to get people registered to vote. But then at the same time, there can be a revolutionary undercurrent happening, because if you're not a like 9th grade tanky, that like revolution doesn't happen that quickly. And I think it's the worst thing that movements can do is to write off one or the other of those routes, when it's really possible to do both. And having us all here is, I think, a really good first step toward that.
Thank you. Diz, no thoughts? You survived the summer? Okay. Anyways, we can post about it on Facebook. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us for this conversation. This was the last broadcast of 2017. We have some exciting updates for 2018 coming ahead. We're gonna keep y'all posted about what's next for TSN, but expect us to keep bringing up the uncomfortable. And I want to shout out Sara and Humayra John for joining us and taking the time to be with us. Shout out to our online audience, Suf, Nida, others who have brought in questions for us. We want this to be as dynamic as possible. Otherwise, where would a girl from Atlanta and North Carolina be in this conversation? We're all spread out all over. So yay for technology for making this happen. So have a good night, y'all. And until the new year. And Reza, I think you will